It really depends on what you're making, because maybe. And I think Katie Arrington has talked about this in the past. Sometimes, unfortunately, every piece of that data, the CAD drawing or the specs that they're using, requires protection. And sometimes the piece you're making doesn't. And I will say that the government's not quite at the point where it's done a great job of determining that. But for the foreseeable future and possibly forever, a lot of that will have to be a communication between the Prime and the DoD and its subcontracting experts, because it's a question that needs an answer, and the answer is entirely dependent on what you're making. You can only share CUI with individuals who have a lawful government purpose to access that information. So if you are using CUI on your networks and they are being audited by a non-government entity or not being audited by someone directed by the government, they would not meet the requirement for a lawful government purpose of accessing that material. So they should not have, and I think people call it sometimes incidental access. At that point, by those procedures, that would be accidental access, and that would be considered a reportable incident.
Gotcha.
If they are doing it on behalf of the government or have been authorized to get incidental access, for instance, if they write that into how CMMC works, that they understand potential incidental access by accreditors, then it wouldn't be an incident, but it would still be something that you'd have to be aware of and attempt to limit, because it's you shouldn't be getting access to that information unless you need it to do your job. So I'll answer kind of two ways. Right now, it's the Wild West. So the answer is just yes. It's everybody's responsibility to try to figure this out together. In the future, the answer doesn't change too much. When the CUI FAR case comes out, the answer is still everyone's going to have to try to figure this out together. We're learning, you're learning, we're working together. But we did go much further in the CUI FAR draft in stating that the government has to provide and have a much better idea of what's going to be CUI under those contracts, and proactively make some determinations and then work with industry on the rest. Encryption is required in the following scenarios. If CUI is on an approved system, whether that be 853 or NIST 80171, moderate confidentiality level system, it must be encrypted in accordance with the requirements of that system while it is on that system. So it may have particular requirements for moving between subparts of that system. When CUI is not on an approved system or subsystem, it must be encrypted in accordance with FIPS 140-2. And there's a reason for that. When we first came out with NIST 80171, that was one of the key pushbacks. Multiple industry associations said FIPS 140-2 is the worst, for lack of a better term. It's expensive, it's hard to implement in certain situations. We heard a lot of bad things about it. In our work with NIST and the cybersecurity experts over there, their philosophy is, if it's not validated, it's not approved, and this is the validation process. And that the risk of using a validated process is lower than using a more recently patched unvalidated one. And so they have stuck with it. Now, there's some confusion in the ITAR world currently, as I believe the new ITAR regulations specifically allow for a unvalidated or non-validated equivalent to FIPS 140-2. So pretty much just the same bit strength protections. That would only apply for information that is not CUI. Once it is CUI, the CUI requirements kick in, and when something is CUI specified, it just because another avenue is permitted doesn't mean it overrules the CUI requirement. If you can comply with both, you should, and FIPS 140-2 requirement meets the government's requirements for CUI and also meets the requirements for ITAR information, because it's specifically called for So not every situation where some increased flexibility is allowed meets that specified nature. I think more information will come from that. We had some initial talks with the ITAR folks, and we're re-engaging with NIST about providing a little bit more guidance on encryption as well. When it is created by or for the government or shared from them, most definitely yes. In situations where that is not true, debatably so, please follow the regulations and requirements as reflected in law. I wouldn't say it's on purpose. It's inherent currently.
Yeah.
I mean, it was predictable, and I don't think it was avoidable. Because what was the other option? The government spends the next 5 years internally implementing the CUI program while telling no one and becoming experts at granular unclassified information markings and categorization and expanding its protections of that information to the DIB without anyone else implementing CUI. I think it was always kind of going to be, we do this together.
Yeah.
And to an extent, in some places, industry will lead the way. So, it's less ambiguous than what currently existed. Good luck trying to find out an answer of whether or not something is or is not FOUO, other than is it marked FOUO? It was kind of a circular argument. This has to be covered by a category or an OPSEC program or things of that nature that specifically allow for and permit its protections. And if it doesn't, then it can't be CUI. So there's a way to cut through that now. And importantly, there's a way to answer that question at an agency. When we were dealing in the world of FOUO, who did you call and ask? Because, essentially you had to ask the contract POC, but they're not going to really have a great answer because the policy and framework wasn't really there. In the classified world, if you had a question about whether or not information was classified, you called and asked your classified rep, your rep for probably DCSA. As agencies create CUI programs, they'll have a CUI office whose job it is to, enforce the standards of the CUI program and get to the bottom of those sorts of questions. And so they'll kind of be the first or second line of defense after, your contract point of contact to help get to the bottom of, is this actually CUI per some real standard or was it mismarked? So I think the ambiguity is temporary. Most of that, personal data and financial stuff will be, generally exempted from the CUI program because it's not created or reflected on our behalf, or it's specifically called out as not part of FCI or the CUI program. The rest of that information, what's going to be covered, again, the government is working on how to have its side ready to answer those questions and address it. One of the things DoD has been working on generally is a better understanding of what information they have, where it is, who has it, and how it's being protected. And that goes hand in hand with the CUI program. So, we can kind of look to examples that we see in the classified world. When you enter a classified contract, you get a good delineation of when something is top secret, when it's secret, when it's confidential, and when it's not classified. And I think in the future, we'll have a better understanding of when it's CUI, when it's not CUI, what made it CUI in the first place, and what can we take out of it so that it's not CUI if we have to share it. And part of the reason that was supposed to be being done prior, the FOUO program considered that information was going to be protected in industry, but because there weren't clearly communicated requirements for it, no one was quite doing the work, and more information was being shared and a lot of it was being lost or stolen. Because of the new costs now associated with compliance with the cybersecurity standards and the visibility of the damage that information's misuse or loss can cause, the CUI program will inherently have to be more fleshed out to better understand who has to be compliant now. So, if they've done it before, while it's by no means one-to-one FOUO to CUI, at the very least, you can have an idea that when the government marked it FOUO, someone thought it was sensitive at that time. It's not a one-to-one translation to CUI. But if you've been working in that world, it's a good place to kind of start thinking about it. The rest of it is, it really depends on what you're working on and how. Context matters for CUI. An application for a web app in a civilian agency targeted at the public that doesn't handle particularly sensitive information is going to have a very different protection scheme than one that's going to be used on a stealth bomber. Even though they're widgets, the contract is going to kind of outline those additional contexts and how that affects what should be protected at those levels. At the same time, I do think that industry has been premature throwing their hands in there saying, we don't know what's sensitive. Because frequently when you're a company creating these widgets or these items for the government, you have a pretty good idea of what it is you do that makes your business different and what you're providing back to the government important. Chances are, if you think it's sensitive, we do too. And there's not a perfect overlap there either. But I do think there's kind of a premature, well, we have no idea what's sensitive on this contract. I'm like, okay, well, the things you found on Wikipedia likely aren't going to be, and the stuff you found on GitHub probably isn't, or at least in its current iteration. It might be once you tailor it to your application. Definitely true. But it's something you have to look at, and maybe you'll need a little bit more context from DoD as to how that application is going to be used, or what fields or data it's going to be handling based on that. But I don't think it's as opaque or as confusing as either DoD or some industry or agencies are saying it is now. Again, all of these laws, regulations, and government-wide policies, for the most part, existed prior to the CUI program and were supposed to be followed, and they did influence the existing practices. So. The 7012 is self-deleting. It only applies if you're receiving CUI or creating or using CUI. If you're not, then when you go to define your system boundaries, you're stuck at, I don't have any. And therefore your boundaries are 0. Nothing has to be compliant because there are no parts of your system that store, process, or transmit CUI. We recognize this as a confusing point to industry in the creation of the CUI FAR case. While we continue to have a self-deleting clause, which I know is not the best contract practice, legal practice, we wanted to ensure that the clause was included in every contract. And if it's a discretionary clause, it will get left out of contracts where it really should be included. So we took that same kind of philosophy, but we went a further step. And that's when I talked about the CUI standard form that will accompany or is part of the draft FAR case, where there's a specific statement, this contract receives CUI, it will include the sharing or creation of CUI, yes or no. And if they answer no, you don't have to meet any of nothing follows. You don't have to meet 171 requirements because you don't have CUI. If they answer yes, then more information follows, talking about what's CUI, where it is, who's handling it, how does it get there, what are the marking requirements, all that other stuff. And then you definitely have to meet 171 if any of that information is going to be on your system. And that's also covered in the NIST 800-171 itself, which says the boundaries of that are determined by where the sensitive information is, where the CUI is. So if you have a contract compliance requirement that states you must meet NIST 800-171 where you store, process, or transmit CUI, and you do not store, process, or transmit CUI, job's done, next clause. If you do, then you have to figure all the rest of that out. It depends. Internal email, like me emailing for myself to another employee at NARA, depending on how the email is configured, may be entirely internal. It doesn't leave our approved 853 moderate confidentiality impact value system, in which case I can just email it. Maybe it goes to a central server and then comes back, maybe it bounces, in which case they may require me to encrypt it. And have a policy inside NARA that says when emailing, even between internal components, it must be formally encrypted by hitting the little encrypt button. There's so many different ways to implement that. If that email is leaving the boundaries of an approved system, it must be encrypted.